Mandela is hope.
The man who transformed a nation and inspired the world. David Muir with the First Lady on her cherished moment with Mandela.
What did you say to him?
I just said, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Robin Roberts and the Mandela family. The private man behind the legend.
He likes to gossip. He'll say, do you know that that one got in trouble for such and such?
The story you haven't heard about his 27 years behind bars. One-on-one with the white jailer who became his most unlikely friend. And the inspiring story behind the hit movie Invictus. The gamble played out on a rugby field that would unite black and white.
I don't think I've ever seen so many grown men on the rugby field crying.
Tonight, the humility.
He said, what is the subject of today's show?
The humor, and the youngest generations he inspired to imagine. As we celebrate Nelson Mandela, a man who changed the world. Here now, David Muir and Robin Roberts.
Good evening. His long walk has come to an end, but now his legacy lives on forever. As we come on the air here tonight, tributes to Nelson Mandela now pouring in from world leaders. Flags at the White House, the UN, and across South Africa now lowered to half-staff.
And tonight we are learning more about the funeral plans and a national week of mourning for the people of South Africa, even as new images come in from people all over the world. They are joining Madiba's countrymen and women as they celebrate the life of the visionary peacemaker who rewrote the pages of history. A nation spent its first full day without its patriarch. But from Johannesburg to Soweto, young, old, black and white sang and danced in celebration of the life of the country's most revered figure.
I think that's what he would wanted us to do, to celebrate his life.
But the impact of Mandela's death reverberated far beyond South Africa as world figures paid tribute to a man who stood head and shoulders above the rest.
I am one of the countless millions who drew inspiration from Nelson Mandela's life.
It was a sad, long goodbye for Mandela. The full reality of his frail health hit home this June when he was rushed to the hospital for a lung infection. Although Mandela was eventually allowed to return home, the end seemed near.
We will fight for our freedom!
But even during this period of decline, his legacy burned as bright as ever. Just last week saw the release of a new biographical feature film about Mandela. In a sad irony, the news of his death came during the London premiere of the movie last night, attended by two of his daughters and the royal couple.
I just want to say it's obviously extremely sad and tragic news. We're just reminded of what an extraordinary and inspiring man Nelson Mandela was.
Meanwhile, one last official journey for Nelson Mandela, from Johannesburg to Pretoria, where his body will lie in state in the capital. Then he will be buried in his ancestral village, a final rest that he, in his own words, was fully at peace with. Death is something inevitable, he once wrote. When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. Now it will be left to others to keep his words and deeds alive. Nelson Mandela met President Obama only once, as seen in this photograph at the start of his career as a U.S. Senator. He was forever inspired.
We will not likely see the likes of Nelson Mandela again. For now, let us pause and give thanks for the fact that Nelson Mandela lived. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages.
Belongs to the ages indeed. Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." And even though we long expected this, his light being gone, David, it's still so difficult for many to take in right now.
It is. We've learned that President Obama and the First Lady will be traveling to South Africa in the coming week. ABC's Alex Marquardt is on the ground in Soweto, South Africa for us tonight. Alex, describe the scene there.
Good evening, David. Good evening, Robin. When you look at the crowd of mourners who have turned out to mourn their beloved former President Mandela, you really understand why this country is called the Rainbow Nation. All across the board of South African society, there is a profound sense of loss, of sorrow, of mourning. And on the flip side of that mourning, you can hear some of it behind me, there is celebration. This is a phenomenon that has broken out across the entire country. They say that they are embodying the spirit of Mandela, who loved life, who was fun, who was funny, and they feel that by celebrating his life, they are embodying Mandela's spirit.
All right, Alex, thank you very much. And now we want to look at the life of the man who transformed himself while behind bars. And you spoke to a young jailer, became Mandela's trusted friend behind bars.
This is an incredible tale, wasn't it? The jailer warned he would be guarding South Africa's most dangerous criminal, but they would form a secret code. Here in America, Mount Rushmore honors the fathers of our democracy. In South Africa, there would be one face. Nelson Mandela, a hero to millions whose devotion to the cause of freedom transformed South Africa.
Mandela was an immensely charismatic figure. Tall, handsome, extroverted, had this fantastic smile, a smile that just lit up whatever room he went into.
But for 27 years, he spent most of his days as a prisoner in this room. And it was there he would meet a young country boy who started out Mandela's enemy, but forged the least likely friendship in history. A prison guard named Christo Brand, who took us to the top of a hill in Cape Town, South Africa, overlooking Robben Island, remembering what they warned him.
They informed us that we're going to meet the biggest criminals in the history of South Africa.
That guard was just 18 years old when he first met his 60-year-old prisoner. The young jailer's family was Afrikaner, the party that famously and fiercely supported apartheid. But when that jailer met Mandela, he met an elder who would treat the young white man with respect, and Christo would slowly offer the same in return. And that jailer told us of one of Winnie Mandela's visits and of her one request, that she be allowed to show Nelson Mandela his brand new grandbaby.
She said, please, can I just show Mandela from a distance? I said, no, just leave the child.
The jailer telling Winnie, no children allowed. But what she didn't know was that while she waited in a holding area, the jailer had secretly brought the baby to Mandela.
So it was just tears coming out of his eyes.
And no one ever knew?
Nobody knew.
Over the years, there would be many secrets between the jailer and his friend, and the secret code.
I will show him this, and I will just start showing him this. Mandela immediately knew I'm bugged. I was bugged a lot of times.
You lied to keep your job and to keep your friendship with Mandela.
That's correct.
During all of those isolating years on Robben Island, the prison guard said there was one view from the prison courtyard of the country Nelson Mandela loved, and that was the very top of Table Mountain here in Cape Town behind me. That Mandela would look to this view wondering if he'd ever be free. But for Mandela, his own freedom was always less important than that of the freedom of the people of South Africa, even as a young man. For if life is a series of choices, Nelson Mandela never took the easy ones. He was born into African royalty, the son of a chief, but chose to become a lawyer for the poor.
I think not until he got to Johannesburg, where he felt the effects of prejudice for the first time, where he felt, my God, you're treating me like this.
His practice, the first black-run law firm in South Africa, was flourishing, but he could not stay neutral against apartheid, a system that made blacks second-class citizens, separate housing and schools, and crushing poverty.
For more than 3 centuries, we have lived under the most brutal system of racial oppression.
Mandela found his calling in the fight against apartheid, a South Africa where the white minority ruled a population that was nearly 90% black.
And created divisions, committed untold massacres on innocent people because they wanted to be treated with dignity.
His party, the African National Congress, was committed to nonviolent resistance. But many of his own supporters would ask why, with so many of their own paying the price.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Peaceful resistance until the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, when white police shot 69 unarmed protesters, the government branding the charismatic leader a terrorist. Mandela went underground.
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. there is room for all the various races in this country.
By 1962, Mandela's fight against apartheid landed him on trial for treason. He could have cooperated, but instead at trial, he gave a rallying speech heard around the world, captured by chance on a dictaphone.
I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The power and defiance and eloquence of that statement really electrified the nation, electrified black South Africa, electrified the world.
Sentenced to life in prison, Mandela spent most of his 27 years behind bars in that cell on Robben Island. Assigned to work in the quarry, shoveling rocks, raking stones, work many believe led to those weakened lungs and to that suffering even in the end. The conditions were brutal.
People were assaulted regularly, people were deprived of meals for 2 or 3 times a day.
Prison was this great crucible that taught him self-control because you had to have it.
Mandela would study for years in the tiny prison library, quietly asking that most unlikely friend, the jailer, to help teach him the language of the whites in power, Afrikaans. He would write essays, and there was a reason for this. Mandela famously saying, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart.
That's what he did. And that's what he was strive for, and that was what he was live for, and that was what he was fight for while he was in prison, to have people live in peace.
To spend 27 years at the prime of your life is a tragedy. And I regret, those years that I have wasted in prison. But I also had the opportunity of reading very widely, especially biographies, and I could see what men, sometimes from very humble beginnings, were able to lift themselves with their bootstrings.
And there was something else he did while on Robben Island. We were given rare access to this tiny archive room in Johannesburg, where they have spent years poring through the tender letters Mandela wrote to his family, to his children, while in prison.
He walked out with it when he left prison, so he took it with him.
In that cell, lined with books and the photograph of Winnie, the notebooks with first drafts of every letter he wrote, every word carefully chosen, because in the beginning he was allowed just one letter every 6 months.
So he needed to know exactly what he wrote so he doesn't waste space.
He wrote to his children about his dream of one day seeing them again.
I do not know, my darlings, when I will return. I told you that the white judge had said I should stay in jail for the rest of my life. It may be long before I come back. It may be soon, nobody knows. It's his name, Nelson Mandela, and then his prison number, 466/64.
Walking strongly, step by step, further into freedom.
When we come back, Nelson Mandela is freed after 27 years. The lines that led to history. And years later, Michelle Obama's visit to South Africa as First Lady. In that room with Mandela.
Nelson Mandela.
Oh, yeah.
What she told him when we return.
And later in the program, the private and surprisingly funny Mandela.
He likes to gossip. When he'll say, do you know that one got in trouble for such and such?
His love affair with the fiery and controversial Winnie Mandela.
He often said to me that Winnie had it much harder than he did.
And his secret plan to use a rugby game to unite black and white. Coming up on Nelson Mandela, a man who changed the world. We continue with Nelson Mandela, a man who changed the world. Once again, David Muir.
Nelson Mandela's name had become a rallying cry, echoing around the world, eventually becoming loud enough to shake open those prison doors.
Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison.
Walking strongly, step by step.
February 11th, 1990, and Nelson Mandela would walk to freedom. Those precious moments before the crowd would see him, captured by photographer David Turnley.
And here's this tall man in his suit, and he was so charming. He hugged everybody. He seemed to know everyone by name. It was as if he'd never been in prison. And he walks to the window, and suddenly the sound from this crowd came rushing into this room, and he stepped out of the window onto the balcony and addressed the world for the first time in 27 years.
In Africa!
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
After all of those years in prison, Mandela could have used his political power to fuel a wave of violence against white oppressors. Instead, he spoke of one country.
I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all.
Mandela and South African President F.W. de Klerk forming an unlikely alliance, an alliance that would bring an end to apartheid, and in 1993 would win them both the Nobel Peace Prize. A year later, Mandela would run for president himself. The stunning aerial images in the towns surrounding Johannesburg, the people of South Africa lining up for miles, allowed to vote for the first time, Nelson Mandela among them. It was a milestone filled with symbolism, a black man, a former political prisoner, about to become president.
It was exciting to be able to exercise a right which in my 76 years was denied to me. And I felt very excited. It was, as I have already said, the realization of a long cherished dream. South Africa belongs to all its people, black and white. The time has come for us to forget the past.
He would chip away at the past in ways large and small. On his first day as president, he met a young woman who worked in the president's office.
You were a typist at the time.
That's correct, yes.
She said she was so nervous in that hallway, he began speaking to her in her own language, Afrikaans, in an effort to put her at ease.
And he saw that I was very emotional, and he said to me, no, 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 calm down.
The humility of a hero, later on display when he visited America, sitting down with Oprah, asking her a question first.
When Mr. Mandela arrived today, he said that a producer met with him in the room, and he said, "What is the subject of today's show?"
After he left office at the age of 81, Nelson Mandela would focus on new fronts. Among them, work to combat the spread of AIDS.
I cannot rest until I'm certain that the global response is sufficient to turn the tide of the epidemic.
But even a superhero slows down. In June of 2004, just before his 86th birthday, Mandela announced he was bowing out of public life, deploying his trademark humor.
But henceforth, I want to be in the position of calling you to ask whether I would be welcome. The appeal, therefore, is don't call me. I'll call you.
And one of those invitations was to First Lady Michelle Obama, who visited Mandela in South Africa in 2011. We sat down with her right after.
Nelson Mandela.
Oh, yeah.
What was it like in that room?
Surreal, something I never thought would happen in my lifetime for me.
What did you say to him?
I told him, I told him, you cannot imagine how important your legacy is to who I am, to who my husband is. And I just said, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mandela's legacy providing a lesson for her daughters and for children all over the world. This South African class we met, born the year Mandela became president, they know the future now rests in their hands.
I don't think you really find many other people like him. I think the fact that he came back without any bitterness and without any anger is because he wasn't worrying about himself. He was worrying about everyone else.
and one more promise kept to his own children. We remember those letters he wrote from prison so many years ago. And in one of them, he writes, "I am certain that one day I will look back. I will be back at home to live in happiness until the end of my days," which is precisely what Nelson Mandela did.
Next, just another rugby game or a revolutionary idea of how to turn a divided country into one?
I don't think I've ever seen so many grown men on the rugby field crying.
You saw it in the movie Invictus, but find out the real story from the people who lived it. Mandela's victory, coming up.
It was the defining challenge of Nelson Mandela's political career to unite the two warring factions of his country. A bold new solution was called for, and nothing was bolder than placing all bets on a game of rugby. For Mandela, it wasn't just a game, but a perfectly chosen symbol of national pride, if they won, that is. The story was dramatized in the movie Invictus, starring Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon. But now, Deborah Roberts talks to the players who lived the real life story.
May 1994. 4 years after his release from prison, Nelson Mandela stands before his nation as South Africa's first democratically elected president. But the remnants of violence and decades of apartheid are dangerously smoldering. His country, still divided, is on the brink of implosion. Black versus white.
In 20 months of increased South African racial violence, more than 750 people have been killed.
It was the worst possible tension you can get between black and white people.
No one will silence the white nation.
As the violence intensifies, Mandela has an unconventional idea. Rally international support to bring the 1995 Rugby World Cup tournament to South Africa and use the world stage to unite his nation. But he's taking a risk because rugby and the South African national team, the Springboks, have long been associated with the very worst of the country's history.
In South Africa, rugby was the white man's game. I hated rugby, I hated those ones who were playing rugby, and I hated the Springboks even more.
Rugby in many ways symbolized apartheid oppression with which black people were being kept down.
But now the man called Madiba by his followers is set on making peace with his former oppressors. He would become a rugby fan, but convincing black South Africans to stand behind the long-hated Springboks would not be easy.
You see this cup that I'm wearing? I ask you all to stand behind them because they are our pride.
Here is the man wanting us to reconcile with these brutish people who have humiliated us for ages in our own country. I wasn't going to be persuaded even by the great Madiba to support the Springboks.
That's the end of the game. Well, who would have believed that South Africa would beat Australia, world champions?
As the tournament begins, the underdog Springboks begin a magical run.
South Africa have beaten France.
But as the team advances, something even more improbable. Black South Africans stand behind the national team.
We started realizing that, you know what, this is our country, this is our brothers, we all have to be behind them.
One team, one country. That was Mandela's vision. And on the morning of the final game, blacks and whites alike swept up in a shared frenzy of excitement. As Mandela drove to Ellis Park Stadium, he saw firsthand what just weeks ago had been unimaginable.
Everywhere was just the World Cup, the World Cup.
Beneath the stadium, the Springboks are preparing, knowing they'd never play a more important game. Moments before they take the field, the silent tension in the locker room is broken.
The door opened, and in walked Nelson Mandela. Nobody knew they was coming to visit us.
Here's the #1 citizen of our country, a black man, wearing a Springbok jersey.
Never in our wildest dreams did we ever expect him to wear a Springbok on his heart.
Two great rivals of New Zealand and South Africa.
The game is tied 12-12 after regulation. The match remains one of the epic finals in rugby history. As play heads into overtime, Mandela sits in the president's box, his great experiment hanging in the balance.
That is it. The final whistle, and South Africa win this Rugby World Cup final.
I don't think I've ever seen so many grown men on the rugby field cry.
After the win, Nelson Mandela, wearing the symbol of his former enemies, prepared to step onto the field.
Nelson, Nelson.
Nelson, Nelson.
I never thought that we would hear that at a rugby stadium.
Just the most phenomenal. It was really quite incredible.
The image of the joyous Mandela celebrating with the national team is mirrored in every corner of the once broken country. It's a turning point. South Africans at last are rejoicing as one.
It was freedom all over. The moment that the cup was handed over to Madiba, I told myself, these are people that I have to build this country together. There's one South Africa. All my hatred is going to gain me absolutely nothing.
Madiba took my hand and he shook it and he said, "Thank you very much for what you've done for South Africa." I said, "Madiba, you got it wrong. Thank you for what you've done for South Africa."
When we come back,
he's a very good mimicker.
The private and personal Mandela. Secrets his children and grandchildren tell us, and they're nothing you'd ever expect.
He likes to gossip. He'll say, "Do you know that one got in trouble for such and such?" It's like, "Granddad, you can't keep secrets."
Next.
I just called to say I love you. I just called.
In so many of the photos of Mandela that we have seen tonight, he's behind a podium inspiring a crowd or marching and meeting world leaders. But what was he like behind the closed doors of his home with his family? Well, we spoke to many of them this past year and came away with a portrait of a man very different than what you might imagine. A life destined for such spectacular greatness began humbly, a small village in the South African territory known as the Transkei.
It's hard to imagine nowadays what it was like to grow up the way he did. That wasn't 1918 by Western standards. That was 1760 by Western standards. There was no light, there was no electricity, there was no running water.
He would attend boarding school and eventually college, but when his tribal father set up an arranged marriage, Mandela fled to Johannesburg and a very different life.
Mandela in the 50s, when he was this young lawyer in Johannesburg, was really a man about town. He drove a fancy American car, and he had had a first marriage and 3 children.
My mom has very fond memories of my father, that my father was a very hands-on husband.
Makaziwe Mandela is Nelson Mandela's daughter from his first marriage.
My father would come home from work and say to her, "Today, don't worry about cooking, washing dishes, or taking care of the children tonight. It's my turn."
But as Mandela morphed into a political leader, that family became the first casualty of the cause.
All of us longed to have those moments, you know, when you can sit on a couch, maybe rest your head on your father. We didn't have those moments.
Mandela's first marriage ended in divorce when Makaziwe was just 4 years old. But soon after, he would find a true soulmate, Winnie.
This was one of the great African love stories of all time. From the moment that he meets her, he just thinks she is the most glorious girl.
They fell unbelievably in love, but almost from the get-go, he was having to go underground. They managed to make 2 beautiful daughters in 2 years before he was then arrested and put on trial and then sent to prison for life.
Winnie's father at the wedding made a toast and said, "You know, my daughter, you're marrying a jailbird." And they all laughed about it, but of course he was in prison a couple of years later.
They would not be allowed contact with him for 8 years, rare visits after that. Winnie became Mandela's voice, the personification of him and his movement. And of course, she became just as much a target of authorities.
He often said to me that Winnie had it much harder than he did. You know, Mandela spent, in all his 27 years in prison, spent one night in solitary confinement. Winnie spent a year in solitary confinement, all of the time having to look after their two daughters.
Those girls were named Zanani and Zinzi.
Prisoners were not allowed to see children under 16, and given that Winnie Mandela's children were both very little girls when he went to jail, that meant he had no contact with them.
But his older daughter, Makaziwe, was able to visit her father in prison.
I expected to hug my dad and everything else, I couldn't. It was a glass window. We kissed on the glass window. We spoke through a telephone.
I think one of the deepest regrets that he has is his failure as a husband, as a father, as a family man, because of all of those years in prison. I mean, he's a very domestic fellow. He loves children.
While in jail, Mandela would try to show that love the only way he could.
He made a tremendous effort to communicate with his children through the letters. Every birthday, you would get a beautiful card. And every card would say, I love you.
So many years pass. Mandela is finally released and once again faces a battle. His role as a leader in the country and the world versus his private life. The marriage with Winnie would not survive.
The world naturally wanted these two bigger-than-life people to come together when he came out of prison and to live happily ever after. I think it was probably, in real terms, a very hard thing to ask.
The Winnie and Mandela divorce, he is still able to forge a family life, but connecting with his 3 surviving children, as well as his 18 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren, remained a challenge.
When he first came out of prison, we thought that we'd have a piece of our grandfather, but it didn't happen that way.
Winnie Mandela is one of those grandchildren.
And I remember saying, Mom, you know, sometimes talking to Granddad is really difficult. And my mom said, Winnie, you have to understand that your grandfather has been in prison for 27 years. You know, he's learning to reconnect.
Keku Mandela Amua met his grandfather for the first time when he was just 4 years old.
As much as being a grandfather was foreign to him, being a nice person was not. And meeting each one of his grandchildren was like building a new friendship with a stranger.
The secret to engaging with my grandfather was to get him to tell you stories about, you know, when he was younger, to get him to tell you stories about his father, because he's a very good mimicker.
Earlier this year, when we spoke with Winnie and Makaziwe, they told us several little-known details about one of the world's most famous men. An even more surprising trait they recalled at that time?
He likes to gossip. He'll say, do you know that that one got in trouble for such and such? It's like, Granddad, you can't keep secrets.
His family says, though Mandela spent much of his life in the spotlight, he often deflected attention to others. A simple pleasure Mandela enjoyed during those precious days at home, reading alone in peace.
And he's reading his newspapers. He lets his newspapers down. How are you, darling? How's school? How's work? How's everything? Great, great. Newspapers up. You know you've been dismissed.
Those closest to Mandela say he had a great sense of humor. And Keku Mandela told us when we spoke last year, that's a big part of the life lesson he took from his grandfather.
I think, you know, he's taught me that you have to be tolerant, and I think the main thing is to smile, you know. He's got a great smile, so I try to emulate that when I can.
Next, the last great fight of Mandela's public life.
My son has died of AIDS.
A personal tragedy that inspired him to help a new generation of children. When we come back.
Nelson Mandela once said, there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. So as Mandela moved into what could be called his final act, he turned his attention to them, especially the children and orphans with HIV. Byron Pitts tonight on Mandela's final push to mobilize the next generation.
January 2005, Nelson Mandela was 86. Retired from public office for 6 years, he called a news conference at his home in Johannesburg to make a stunning announcement.
My son has died of AIDS.
Makato Mandela was 54. This public admission by this proud and now private man is considered the pivotal moment in how the nation of South Africa and much of the continent would view the AIDS epidemic moving forward.
For him to actually stand up and admit that there was something within his family, something in his own son, was very important because it made other people feel that it normalized HIV.
Because if it could happen to Nelson Mandela's family,
it can happen to anybody.
Although an estimated 5 million South Africans were infected with the HIV virus at the time, and more than 2 million had already died, AIDS was a shameful and taboo topic. That stigma had thwarted attempts to prevent and treat the disease.
We must not hide the cause of death of our respective families, because that is the only way in which we can make people understand that even HIV is an ordinary illness.
The fight against AIDS in South Africa was the old lion's last major campaign. As president, he'd remained mostly silent on the matter. But in the midst of his private loss, he found his public voice.
I cannot rest until I'm certain that the global response is sufficient to turn the tide of the epidemic.
And as usual for Mandela, there were no halfway measures as it lent the power and prestige of his face and name to the cause, appearing at huge international events like this anti-AIDS concert, creating the 46664 Fund, his old prison number, now used to raise awareness and money in the fight against AIDS.
I would love to enjoy the peace and quiet of retirement. But I know that, like many of you, I cannot rest easily while our beloved continent is ravaged by a deadly epidemic.
His presence was absolutely incredible. When he spoke, the world listened.
And nowhere was that impact greater than among the most vulnerable of South Africa's population, young children stigmatized by society. Children like 13-year-old Gugulethu Tombela, one of the more than 300,000 South African kids living with the HIV virus. Google, as she's called, has been living with HIV since birth. But in her despair, a beacon of hope was Nelson Mandela's fight for the protection of kids and those living with HIV and AIDS.
The fight against AIDS is one of the greatest challenges the world faces.
Inspired by Mandela's example, this brave teenager picked up the pieces of her life and moved on. At her Johannesburg high school, she's a natural leader, active in sports, and a star student.
There's a hero.
Always singing, she's also open about her HIV status, despite the many people too scared or embarrassed to admit they have the virus.
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay. And I must say that I'm strong, brave, and intelligent.
It's a confidence born from the spirit of her country's patriarch, who himself endured so much.
When the history of our times is written, will we be remembered as the generation that turned our backs in a moment of a global crisis